Hi there. If you're here, you're probably looking for two things: a little history and a lot of sleep. So lie back, get comfortable, maybe dim the lights, maybe fluff your pillow like it owes you money, and let me take you back to a time when mornings smelled like smoke, afternoons burned like pepper, and even the trees could get you in trouble. Welcome to the Aztec Empire, where justice was swift, clothes were optional during punishment, and the worst crime you could commit might be laziness. But don't worry, we'll take it slow. Let your muscles relax, let your mind drift, and let's slip quietly into Chapter 1. The Aztec Empire. A place of grand temples, gleaming feathers, gold jewelry, and cultural complexity. You might imagine priests chanting under a blazing sun while graceful dancers whirl across sacred courtyards. The truth? Less graceful whirling, more sweat, more fleas, more people yelling about corn. It's tempting to romanticize ancient civilizations. But day-to-day life in the Aztec world was more like a never-ending group project in a city with no plumbing and a serious obsession with cosmic order. And if you broke that order, oh dear listener, things got very creative. Before we dive into the weird and wonderful world of Aztec punishments, let's first walk in the sandals of someone just trying to survive a typical day. Spoiler, it involves a lot of sweeping. Now, I know what you're thinking. But weren't the Aztecs these magnificent warriors with jade masks and golden ornaments? Well, yes and no. The elites certainly enjoyed their jade and gold, much like how your boss enjoys their corner office while you're stuck in the cubicle with the flickering light. For every priest adorned in Quetzal feathers, there were thousands of ordinary folks just trying not to offend the rain god while securing enough maize to feed their children. Imagine, if you will, a civilization where the greatest architectural achievements coexisted with neighborhoods where the primary sanitation strategy was sweep it away and hope for the best. A place where astronomers could predict eclipses with stunning accuracy, but nobody had invented toilet paper. That's the Aztec Empire for you, sublime and sweaty all at once. The temples of Tenochtitlan reached toward the heavens, yes, gleaming white, visible for miles across the lake. But get closer, and you'd notice the scent, incense mixed with the unmistakable odor of human sacrifice, blood cascading down temple stairs, drying in the sun. Not quite the tourist attraction you'd expect. TripAdvisor reviews would be mixed at best. 5 stars for architectural grandeur, -4 for the concerning amount of hearts being removed. Would possibly visit again during a non-sacrifice season, if such a thing exists. Let's be honest. If you transported yourself back to the height of Aztec civilization, you wouldn't be immediately invited to lounge around in feathered regalia sipping chocolate. More likely, you'd be handed a broom and told to start sweeping. Or worse, you'd be identified as a stranger and, well, let's just say the priests were always looking for volunteers, and not for community theater. The cosmic order that governed Aztec life wasn't some abstract philosophical concept debated by scholars over cups of pulque. It was an everyday, omnipresent force that shaped everything from when you woke up to which foot you put forward first when entering a temple. Break the rules, and you weren't just being rude. You were potentially unraveling the fabric of the universe. No pressure. This rigorous devotion to order created a society where ritual permeated everything. You didn't just start your day. You performed the ritual of mourning. You didn't simply plant corn. You enacted the sacred relationship between human, seed, and soil. Even going to the bathroom came with its own set of customs and taboos, though thankfully those rituals were somewhat less elaborate. Even the gods understood that some things can't wait for a 12-step ceremonial process. So, before we get into the nitty-gritty of Aztec justice and punishment, take a moment to appreciate just how regulated everyday life was. The cosmic order wasn't maintained just through dramatic heart extractions and ceremonial battles. It was reinforced through millions of tiny actions performed by ordinary people every single day. And that's where we'll start our journey. With the ordinary, the mundane, the relentlessly sweaty reality of living in one of history's most fascinating and misunderstood civilizations. Hold on to your loincloths, dear listeners. It's going to be a bumpy, broom-filled ride. Chapter 2. You wake up. No, not to birdsong, to shouting, to smoke, to the distant rhythmic pounding of maize being ground on stone. Your bed, a woven mat, comfortable? Not really, but it beats sleeping on a dirt floor next to a suspiciously bold turkey. The air smells like yesterday's fire and today's breakfast. You hope it's amaranth porridge and not reheated beans again. You rub your eyes, grab your loincloth or shift, step outside and instantly regret it. It's barely dawn and the sun is already plotting your demise. Water? Cold, always cold. Soap? More like scratchy paste. Dental care? Chewing sticks and prayers. Your chores? Endless. Sweep the courtyard, carry firewood, feed the dog, feed the turkey, apologize to the turkey for yesterday. And that's just before breakfast. Once the basics are out of the way, you join the morning bustle. Everyone's doing something. Your neighbor is weaving. The guy across the alley is carving obsidian. Someone nearby is already yelling about squash prices. Again, breakfast is corn tortillas, maybe a bit of beans. If you're lucky, a spicy sauce made with wild tomatoes and smoked chili. If you're very lucky, some squash blossoms or a bit of rabbit. But usually it's tortillas. You eat sitting on the ground, sharing with family, brushing away flies with the slow, practiced flick of the wrist. Eating is a quiet moment, brief, because soon the day demands more. If you're a child, you're off to school, which, by the way, isn't optional. Education is mandatory in the Aztec Empire, that's right. Every child goes to school, but don't expect recess and nap time. Expect memorizing hymns, lots of hymns, and carrying heavy bundles to teach humility. If you're training for war, your day is full of drills, discipline, and more drills. You'll spend hours learning how to throw a spear, swing a macahuitl, and run in sandals without tripping over your own determination. If you're a merchant, you're heading to the market. And what a market it is. The Tlatelolco market is enormous, thousands of vendors. You can buy anything from turquoise earrings to roasted grasshoppers. It's noisy, colorful, and always a little overwhelming. And if you're a woman, you're probably doing 3 jobs at once. Grinding maize, weaving cloth, tending to children, and maybe selling something at the market too. Rest? A luxury for after the sun goes down. The heat grows as the day progresses. Sweat clings to your back. The streets buzz with activity. The scent of cooking, sweating, praying, shouting, and sweeping blends into the air like a slow-cooked stew. And don't forget to greet the gods. There are rituals at every corner, incense burning, flowers laid out in little altars. You pass them respectfully, eyes down, just in case. You try to avoid eye contact with the temple guards, not because they're unfriendly, but because they're watching for anyone suspicious. Stealing, lying, acting out of place, justice here is fast and visible. Afternoon brings more work. Maybe you help with repairs. Maybe you carry water. Maybe you weave until your fingers are numb. Time doesn't move fast. It stretches, heavy with effort and obligation. Dinner? It looks like breakfast. Maybe a bit more variety. Maybe some wild greens or a tamale if it's a special day. You eat by firelight, listening to elders talk about the gods, the wars, the time your cousin tripped on temple stairs and became a minor legend. At night you finally lie back down on that mat. Your back hurts, your feet are sore, but you made it through the day. You survived the heat, the work, the chili. Tomorrow you'll do it all again. Unless you spill the ceremonial drink, then, well, you might meet Aztec justice up close. Let's zoom in a bit more on that morning routine, shall we? Because waking up Aztec style isn't just opening your eyes and hitting snooze. It's an exercise in immediate, unavoidable reality. First, there's the mat, your petate. It's woven reed, and while it's not exactly memory foam, there's an art to making one that doesn't stab you with stray fibers all night. Your family probably has several, rolled up during the day to create more space in your one-room home. If you're married, you share with your spouse. If you're a child, you might be sandwiched between siblings, using each other for warmth during the Highland chill. The blanket situation? Limited. Maybe a thin cotton cloth. Maybe nothing. The Aztec approach to comfort was, shall we say, minimalist. You didn't complain about thread count or pillow firmness. You were just happy if nothing crawled into your ear overnight. Speaking of unwelcome visitors, let's talk about the wildlife sharing your living space. That turkey we mentioned? Not just passing through. Many families kept turkeys, dogs, and occasionally other animals right inside their homes. The concept of outdoor pets wasn't really a thing. That turkey probably has a name. It probably also has attitude. After months of cohabitation, you've developed a complex relationship based on mutual tolerance and the understanding that one day it will probably become dinner during a festival. As for your home itself, if you're an ordinary citizen, you're living in a kali, a simple one-story, one-room house. Walls made of adobe brick or wattle and daub if you're further from the city center. The floor is packed earth, swept obsessively because cleanliness wasn't just about aesthetics. It was a moral and religious obligation. The roof is thatched, requiring regular maintenance to prevent leaks during the rainy season. No windows, just a doorway covered with a mat for privacy. Your house is part of a kalpali, a neighborhood or district organized around kinship and profession. Everyone around you is either related to you or practices the same trade. This creates a unique social dynamic where your entire community knows exactly what you're up to at all times. Privacy, an alien concept. Your business is everybody's business, particularly your mistakes. Now, about that morning toilet situation. No, there's no bathroom as you know it. If you're in the city, there might be a communal latrine area. If you're lucky, it's a designated spot over water. If you're less lucky, it's just a designated corner. Toilet paper, please. You're using water, leaves, or a corn cob. Yes, a corn cob. History isn't always glamorous. Hygiene, however, was taken seriously. The Aztecs were cleaner than many of their contemporary civilizations. You're expected to wash daily, even if it's just a quick scrub with cold water from the nearest source. The soap-like substance comes from the amoli plant, a natural saponin that creates a lather. Not exactly shower gel, but it gets the job done. Teeth cleaning involves that chewing stick we mentioned, a twig from specific trees with mild antiseptic properties. You chew one end until it frays, then use it like a primitive toothbrush. There's also salt for rinsing. Bad breath was socially unacceptable, and the elite even used breath fresheners made from herbs and spices. Now, personal appearance. If you're a man, you're pulling on a loincloth, maxtladel, and, depending on the weather or your social status, perhaps a cloak, tilmatli. Women are wrapping themselves in a long skirt, quaital, and a sleeveless blouse, huipili. Everything is cotton or maguey fiber, cotton being the more comfortable, expensive option. Colors and patterns signal your status, profession, and even your neighborhood. Wearing the wrong design could be confusing at best, offensive at worst. Hair needs attention too. For both men and women, long hair was the norm, carefully combed and often adorned. Men might have partial shaves depending on their profession and rank. Women typically wore their hair in braids or other elaborate styles that signaled marital status and social position. Those fancy hairstyles you see depicted in codices? They're not just for special occasions. They're everyday identifiers, social media profiles made of hair. And now, to those morning chores. The sweeping isn't casual housekeeping, it's a ritual act. The broom itself, a tlakpanoni, is made of stiff grasses and has spiritual significance. Sweeping symbolizes putting the world in order, removing chaos, preparing sacred space. When you sweep your doorway and the space around your house, you're participating in a microcosm of the larger cosmic maintenance performed by priests at temples. Gathering water might mean a trip to the neighborhood well, or, if you're in the heart of Tenochtitlan, accessing the ingenious system of aqueducts that brought fresh water from the mainland. Water carriers were also a thing, a profession unto itself. If you could afford to pay someone else to handle this daily chore, that firewood you're gathering, another critical task. Without refrigeration, daily cooking was essential. The family hearth wasn't just for preparing food, it was the center of household life, providing warmth, light, and protection from insects. A family without fire was a family in serious trouble. Now, about that turkey again. Feeding the household animals wasn't just about keeping pets alive. These creatures were investments. The dog might help hunt or provide protection. The turkey would eventually become food for a special occasion or a trade item. Treating them well wasn't sentimentality, it was economic sense. By the time you've finished these essential morning tasks, the sun is properly up and the day's real work begins. But not before breakfast, that critical fuel for the labor ahead. And yes, it really is mostly corn tortillas. Corn was life. The Aztec creation myths featured maize as the substance from which humans were made. You weren't just eating breakfast, you were consuming your cosmic connection to existence itself. Those tortillas, tlaxcali, are fresh made that morning. The women of the household having risen before everyone else to begin the nixtamalization process. This involved cooking dried corn with lime, grinding it on a stone metate, and forming the dough into thin rounds that cook quickly on a hot clay griddle, kamali. The process is time-consuming but essential. The lime treatment makes the corn more nutritious, preventing the malnutrition that would otherwise result from a primarily corn-based diet. Beans, when available, provided crucial protein. They might be mashed, whole, or cooked into a soup. Those spicy sauces made with chilies didn't just add flavor, they provided essential vitamins and helped preserve food in a world without refrigeration. Squash completed the trinity of Mesoamerican staples, the three sisters of corn, beans, and squash that sustained civilizations. Meat was a luxury for most ordinary people, reserved for special occasions or as a rare treat. The empire had no large domesticated animals like cattle or pigs. Protein came from beans, chia seeds, amaranth, and occasionally game like rabbits, turkeys, ducks, or fish from the lake. Insects, particularly grasshoppers, were another important protein source. Nutritious, abundant, and easy to harvest. Not quite bacon and eggs, but practical in a world without industrial agriculture. After breakfast, the family disperses to their daily responsibilities. And this is where Aztec life really diverges based on your role in society. Let's follow a few different paths. For a child around 7 years old, it's off to school, the Telpoch for most commoners, or the Kalmakak for nobles and those destined for priesthood. The Telpoch House of Youth, emphasized practical education, military training, and civic responsibility. The Kalmakak focused more on literacy, history, religious training, and leadership. At the Telpoch your day involves physical training, learning essential crafts, memorizing religious songs and stories, and receiving stern moral instruction. Discipline is fierce. Those heavy bundles we mentioned, not metaphorical. Children carried actual loads of wood, water, or other materials as part of their education in endurance and service. Mistakes earned swift punishment, often involving cactus spines or sitting in smoke from burning chilies. Modern anti-bullying policies were, shall we say, still several centuries away. But before you judge too harshly, consider this. The Aztecs valued education so highly that they mandated it for all children regardless of gender or social class, something many advanced civilizations wouldn't achieve until the 19th or 20th centuries. Girls received training in household management, crafting, religious practices, and sometimes specialized skills like midwifery or medicinal knowledge. Boys learned trade skills, military basics, and community obligations. Everyone learned history, moral codes, and proper social behavior through songs, stories, and relentless repetition. For a young warrior in training, your day at the Telpoch would be particularly rigorous. You're learning to use weapons, the macuahuitl, a wooden sword edged with obsidian blades, atlatl, spear thrower, bow and arrow, and basic shields. You're running, sometimes for miles. You're learning formation, fighting, and battlefield signals. More importantly, you're being indoctrinated into the warrior ethos, the belief that capturing enemies for sacrifice was the highest calling, that death in battle or on the sacrifice stone was glorious, that personal courage outweighed personal safety. The training wasn't just physical, it was psychological. Young warriors performed increasingly difficult and sometimes painful rituals to prove their readiness for battle. These might include bloodletting from ears, tongue, or other body parts, extended fasting, sleep deprivation, or exposure to harsh conditions. The goal wasn't just to create effective fighters, but to forge individuals who could endure suffering without complaint, a crucial trait in a society where ritual pain was part of religious expression. For a merchant, Pochteca, your day takes a different path. You might be preparing to journey to distant provinces or managing your stall at the grand market of Tlatelolco. If you're a long-distance trader, you're part profession, part spy, part diplomat. Merchants often worked as intelligence gatherers for the empire, reporting back on conditions in other territories, potential military vulnerabilities, or resources worth targeting. The Pochteca formed their own hereditary class, with specific neighborhoods, laws, and customs. Far from being simple shopkeepers, elite merchants could accumulate wealth rivaling that of nobles, though they were expected to display modesty in public. Their homes might be luxurious inside but deliberately simple outside. Flaunting wealth too obviously could draw unwanted attention from nobility, or even accusations of overstepping social boundaries, a dangerous situation. If you're headed to the market today, you're joining one of the most impressive commercial enterprises in the pre-modern world. The market at Tlatelolco could accommodate up to 60,000 people daily. Yes, you read that correctly. It was meticulously organized by product type, with designated areas for textiles, pottery, jewelry, medicinal herbs, live animals, prepared foods, and much more. Special judges patrolled the grounds, weighing goods, verifying quality, and settling disputes on the spot. The market wasn't just about commerce, it was a social hub. News spread, relationships formed, reputations built or destroyed. For many, particularly women selling household goods or prepared food, the market provided critical income and a rare opportunity for public interaction beyond the family compound. The soundscape alone was overwhelming. Thousands of conversations in Nahuatl punctuated by animal noises, the calls of vendors, and the occasional shout of market judges identifying a fraudulent seller. For craft specialists, weavers, potters, featherworkers, goldsmiths, obsidian knappers, the day revolves around your workshop, likely attached to your home. Your children serve as apprentices, learning the family trade from an early age. Your craft might be hereditary, with techniques passed down through generations and jealously guarded as family secrets. If you're particularly skilled, you might produce goods for noble consumption, or even for the emperor himself. A dangerous honor that could bring prestige or punishment depending on how your work is received. For farmers, who made up the majority of the population, your day requires leaving the city for the Chinampas, the famous floating gardens that fed Tenochtitlan. These weren't actually floating, but were artificial islands created in the shallow lake bed, among the most productive agricultural systems ever devised. Navigating to your plot by canoe, you spend your day maintaining these miracles of agricultural engineering, dredging nutrient-rich mud from the lake bottom, maintaining the complex irrigation systems, planting, weeding, harvesting. Farmers didn't own the land outright. It belonged to the Kalpoli community, with plots allocated to families based on size and need. You farmed your allocated plot, paid taxes and agricultural goods, and contributed labor to communal projects. Neglecting your agricultural duties wasn't just a personal failure, it was a community offense that could result in losing your land rights or worse. For nobles, Pipiltan, the day involves more administration than physical labor, though appearances matter tremendously. You might be hearing local disputes, organizing community projects, overseeing tax collection, or attending to religious duties. The nobility wasn't a leisure class in the European sense. They were working administrators with significant responsibilities. Failure could mean not just personal disgrace, but actual punishment. Nobles who failed in their duties or behaved immorally faced harsher penalties than commoners, under the principle that those with greater privilege should meet higher standards. For priests, the day revolves around an intricate schedule of rituals determined by multiple calendar systems operating simultaneously. The 260-day ritual calendar, Tonalpohualli, and the 365-day solar calendar, Jupohualli, created an elaborate cycle of religious obligations. Priests tracked these complex intersections, performing appropriate ceremonies almost constantly. Their duties included maintaining temple fires, performing sacrifices, animal and human, interpreting omens, preserving knowledge, treating illness, and educating noble youth. The higher ranks of priests lived lives of remarkable austerity, practicing frequent fasting, bloodletting, and sleep deprivation in service to the gods. And what about the emperor himself, the Tlatoani? speaker. His day began before dawn with ritual bathing and prayers. Every aspect of his appearance, movement, and speech was regulated by complex protocol. He attended multiple councils, received reports from throughout the empire, judged difficult legal cases, planned military campaigns, and participated in exhausting religious ceremonies. While surrounded by luxury and served by hundreds, the Tlatoani's personal freedom was perhaps the most restricted of all, his body and behavior the most visible embodiment of state power and cosmic order. For women, regardless of social class, the day is filled with essential production alongside any class-specific duties. Even noble women engaged in weaving, the quintessential female activity with both practical and symbolic significance. Textile production was so central to female identity that weaving implements were buried with women and goddesses were depicted with weaving tools. Women's labor created essential household goods, clothing, trade items, and ritual objects. They also prepared all meals, managed household resources, raised children, and maintained homes. But women's roles extended beyond domestic production. They served as midwives, healers, priestesses, market vendors, and artisans. Some evidence suggests women could own property independently and engage in legal contracts. Motherhood brought particular status. Women who died in childbirth were honored similarly to warriors who died in battle, both believed to accompany the sun during different parts of its daily journey. As the afternoon progresses, perhaps you witness one of the ball games being played in the neighborhood court. The famous Mesoamerican ball game, Tlachtli, wasn't just entertainment, it was ritual, diplomacy, conflict resolution, and sometimes a literal matter of life and death. Players used their hips to keep a heavy rubber ball in play, trying to strike it against markers or through stone rings mounted high on the court walls. The game reenacted cosmic struggles, with the ball representing the sun moving through the underworld. For commoners, local games might be primarily recreational, but formal matches involving nobles or professional players could have profound political and religious significance. Throughout your day, you navigate a world dense with meaning. Every object, gesture, and location carries significance beyond its immediate function. Colors correspond to directions and divine forces. Numbers have sacred associations. Even the way you enter a building, which foot crosses the threshold first, can have ritual importance. Daily life isn't separate from religious observance. It is religious observance. Each swept floor, each properly performed task, each respectful greeting helps maintain that cosmic order we mentioned. As evening approaches, the market closes, workers return from fields, and families reunite in household compounds. The main meal of the day is prepared and eaten, similar to breakfast but perhaps with more variety or abundance. Food is always eaten with fingers, with water for washing hands before and after. Dishes are simple: gourds, ceramic bowls, woven mats as plates. The family might sit on mats around a central cooking fire, the hierarchy clear in who eats first and who gets choice portions. After the meal comes one of the few opportunities for leisure. This might mean storytelling, especially from elders to younger family members, an essential way of transmitting history, morality, and practical knowledge. Perhaps there's music from simple drums, clay flutes, or rattles. Maybe a game of patoli, a sort of board game played with beans as dice that the Aztecs enjoyed with sometimes ruinous enthusiasm, occasionally gambling themselves right into slavery when bets went bad. The most common evening activity, though, is simply conversation, reviewing the day's events, planning tomorrow's work, discussing community matters. In a world without electric light, activities follow the sun. As darkness falls, the only illumination comes from the hearth fire, or perhaps resin torches for special occasions. Most people are in bed not long after sunset, conserving energy for tomorrow's labors. As you settle back onto your mat for the night, perhaps you reflect on the day's successes, the lack of mistakes that might have angered gods or authorities, the food secure for tomorrow, the small pleasures found amid constant labor. You've survived another day in one of history's most complex and demanding civilizations. Your back aches from work, your mind swims with obligations and taboos, but you've done your part to keep the cosmic wheels turning, unless, of course, you haven't. Unless you slipped up somewhere, broke a rule, offended a deity. Then, as you drift off to sleep, your dreams might be troubled by visions of what awaits those who disturb the sacred order. The swift and creative justice that maintains the precarious balance between civilization and chaos. Sleep well. Morning comes early in the Aztec world, and the gods are always watching. Chapter 3. So you've survived a day in Tenochtitlan. Well done. Not everyone does. And now, as the sun sets over the calm lake and the torches begin to flicker along the causeways, let's look at the other side of the Aztec Empire, the part the tourist brochures would leave out. Let's talk about the shadows, the real ones, not just the ones cast by temple walls. Because beneath the rhythm of grinding maize and market gossip was a world held together by strict codes, sacred terror, and the kind of justice that was loud, public, and sticky. Let's start with health, or rather the absence of it. There were no antibiotics, no antiseptic, no chicken soup when you had a cold. If you fell ill, you prayed, you burned incense, you made offerings, and then maybe you saw a healer who chewed on roots, blew smoke on your face, and possibly diagnosed you with, "You made the gods angry." Medicine was spiritual as much as it was botanical. Herbal remedies were clever, but the underlying theory was often more myth than science. You didn't just have a stomachache. You had offended Tlaloc, or your soul was crooked, or a sorcerer cursed your maize porridge. And if you were wounded, say, in battle, treatment often involved obsidian blades, pulque, and prayers. The pulque helped. The rest was less comforting. Infection? A real possibility. Amputation? Also on the table. Anesthesia? Hope you enjoy the taste of leather. Of course, illness wasn't rare. People got sick. A lot. The combination of communal living, poor sanitation, and constant labor meant your immune system was on a treadmill. Not the sleek modern kind with built-in fans, but the ancient kind, made of stone, uphill both ways. Some diseases were so feared they were treated like spiritual invasions. Children might be covered in amulets. Elders might consult astrologers. Whole neighborhoods could enter periods of ritual silence or fasting. There were healers called Taisidal, and they worked with herbs, minerals, and animal products. They were respected, but feared too. After all, if someone could cure a curse, maybe they could cast one too. Now let's talk about slavery. Aztec slavery wasn't quite the same as what we associate with later empires, but it was still very real and very common. You could sell yourself into slavery to pay debts, or be enslaved as punishment, or lose a bet. Yes, really, one bad game of Patoli, and suddenly you're carrying firewood for someone else until the end of time, or until they sell you. Slaves could own property, marry, even buy their freedom. But they were also, well, slaves. And while some owners were decent, others took full advantage. Escaping wasn't easy. You had to run to a palace, grab the door ring, and hope someone declared you free before your master tackled you. Sometimes people sold their children voluntarily to escape poverty. Imagine being so poor that giving up your kid felt like a blessing. And the system was widespread enough that entire markets had special zones just for trading slaves. But perhaps more disturbing than the practice itself was how normalized it was. It wasn't hidden, it wasn't shameful, it was life. And if you weren't a slave, you were just lucky you hadn't made the wrong enemy or the wrong gamble. And what about punishment? Let's say you got caught stealing. The first time, you might just be shamed, publicly, loudly, emphatically. The second time, you might be enslaved. The third time, well, let's just say your skin and the local priest might become very closely acquainted. Aztec punishments were rarely quiet. They were performances. Public shaming was common. So was symbolic punishment. Cut down the wrong tree? You might be paraded through town with cactus thorns in your arms. Lie in court? You could be painted black and labeled for all to see. There was a punishment for almost everything. Adultery, death, public drunkenness, if you were young, also death, disrespecting your elders. You might be tied up and forced to inhale chili smoke until you cried out every bad decision you'd ever made. Children weren't exempt. In fact, they were held to a high standard. Disobey your parents, get tossed into the chili smoke room, complain about chores. Hello, cactus spine discipline. There was an entire category of punishments just for teens. And if you were noble, the punishment was worse. You were supposed to know better. So instead of lashes, maybe you'd get your land taken, or your head. Justice was fast, efficient, brutal, and memorable. It wasn't just about deterring crime. It was about reminding everyone watching that the world only worked when the rules were followed. Break the rules, and the system would break you, but politely, with ceremony. Religious rituals added another layer of fear. These weren't quaint gatherings with harp music and grape juice. These were massive, theatrical, and often terrifying. Human sacrifice wasn't just for fun, it was essential. The gods needed blood, the sun needed fuel, so hearts were offered, and not symbolically. You might be chosen, or your enemy, or your neighbor, or a slave. The process was loud, bloody, and steeped in meaning. And while we shudder at the violence, for the Aztecs, it was devotion in its rawest form. Even festivals had an edge. You might be celebrating the new harvest one moment and watching someone flayed the next. That's not just a party. That's a moral reminder you'll never forget. And let's not forget superstition. The Aztecs believed the world was a cycle of creation and destruction, and keeping that cycle going was everyone's job. Omen birds, eclipses, strange dreams, all taken seriously. A bad sign could send a community into days of fasting, sacrifice, or ritual cleansing. The priests were more than just religious leaders. They were astronomers, doctors, historians, and sometimes executioners. They could chart the stars and prescribe medicine. They could also decide who lived and who was better off helping keep the sun afloat. Even the calendar was a kind of discipline. It told you when to plant, when to harvest, when to sacrifice, and when to rest. Time itself had moral weight. Miss a holy day, and you didn't just get a dirty look. You risked cosmic imbalance. There was beauty in this world, yes. Poetry, art, music, philosophy. But behind every blossom was a blade, and behind every calm surface the possibility of chaos. Because to the Aztecs, the world was always on the brink. Always. You walked through a world where balance wasn't just hoped for, it was enforced. Where order wasn't gentle but absolute. Where everyone, from peasant to emperor, was always a few mistakes away from a very public reminder of the rules. And the fear? It wasn't paranoia, it was structure. It was glue. It was how a sprawling, complicated empire held itself together without collapsing into daily rebellion. So when you walked the streets of Tenochtitlan, you didn't just step over stones. You stepped through a philosophy, a belief system, a worldview where punishment wasn't just retribution. It was prevention, education, performance, and maybe a little terrifying. Let's delve deeper into the Aztec approach to medicine and healing, shall we? Because nothing reveals a culture's worldview quite like how they handle human frailty. The Tixitl, healers, weren't just applying random herbs and hoping for the best. They worked within a complex theoretical framework that saw illness as an imbalance between hot and cold forces in the body, or as spiritual intrusion by malevolent entities. Much like today's doctors have specialties, Aztec healers often focused on particular types of ailments: bone setters, midwives, herbalists, and those who specialized in treating spiritual afflictions. Their pharmacopoeia was impressively extensive. Hundreds of medicinal plants were known and used, many of which modern science has confirmed contain active medicinal compounds. Willow bark, containing salicylic acid, the precursor to aspirin for pain. Maguey sap for wounds. Various fungi for infections. The knowledge was sophisticated enough that Spanish conquerors actually took medical texts back to Europe, where some Aztec remedies became part of Western medicine. But alongside this practical knowledge was a parallel system of spiritual diagnosis. If your treatment wasn't working, perhaps you had confessed to the wrong sin. If your fever worsened, maybe your offering was insufficient. If your wound became infected, possibly your birth date was cosmically misaligned with your treatment date. This duality created a medical system that could be remarkably effective or utterly ineffective, depending on what ailed you and which healer you saw. Break a bone? A skilled bone setter might fix you up relatively well. Develop smallpox? Well, better start preparing for your journey to the underworld. A typical visit to a healer might begin with divination, casting seeds or reading patterns to determine the spiritual cause of your ailment. This would be followed by a physical examination, where the healer might palpate painful areas, check your pulse, examine bodily fluids, or smell your breath. Treatment could involve herbal remedies, massage, steam baths, or more invasive procedures like bloodletting or minor surgery using obsidian blades, which are actually sharper than modern surgical steel. For serious illnesses, treatment was often a family affair. Relatives might be required to participate in fasting, prayer, or other ritual activities to support the healing process. Your community could be prescribed specific behaviors to help rebalance the spiritual forces affecting you. Healing wasn't individual, it was collective. Childbirth deserves special mention, as it was surrounded by elaborate ritual and practical care. Midwives held high status and worked with both physical techniques and spiritual protection. Pregnant women received specialized diets and prenatal care. Yet despite this attention, childbirth remained incredibly dangerous, so much so that women who died in labor were honored as warriors, believed to capture the powerful spirit of a setting sun. The Temazcali, sweat bath, played a crucial role in both preventative health and treatment. Similar to a modern sauna but with ritual significance, these stone structures were used for purification, relaxation, and treating various ailments. Herbs were thrown on hot stones to create medicinal steam. The experience was both hygienic and holy, physical cleaning and spiritual cleansing in one steamy package. But what happened when healing failed? When the herbs didn't work, the prayers went unanswered and death approached. This is where the Aztec worldview reveals its most profound differences from our own. Death wasn't the end of existence, but a transition to another phase, one of several afterlives determined not by moral behavior, but by how you died. Warriors slain in battle and women who died in childbirth went to the highest heaven, accompanying the sun. Those who drowned or died from water-related causes went to Tlalocan, a paradise ruled by the rain deity. Most ordinary people descended to Mictlan, the underworld, undertaking a challenging 4-year journey through 9 levels before reaching their final resting place. This meant that a good death was often more important than a long life. Some people chosen for sacrifice genuinely believed they were ascending to a divine honor, not being punished. The warrior's ideal wasn't to die peacefully in bed, but to end gloriously on the battlefield or sacrifice stone. Funeral practices reflected these beliefs. Bodies were wrapped in mantles, often with jade beads placed in the mouth to serve as the heart in the afterlife. Possessions needed for the afterlife journey were buried with the deceased. Water for the road, tools for obstacles, even a small dog to guide the soul across the final river. Cremation was common for nobles, while commoners were typically buried. Grief wasn't suppressed, quite the opposite. Mourning was ritualized, public, and physically expressed. Widows cut their hair. Parents of dead children gathered regularly for communal crying. Professional mourners might be hired for important funerals. Like everything in Aztec society, even sorrow had its proper performance. Speaking of performance, let's return to that most infamous aspect of Aztec culture: human sacrifice. Modern sensibilities recoil, but understanding the practice requires temporarily setting aside our own worldview and entering a cosmology where these acts made terrible, necessary sense. The Aztecs believed that the gods had sacrificed themselves to create the world and humanity. The god Nanahuatzin threw himself into a divine fire to become the sun. The goddess Mayahuel was dismembered to create the maguey plant that provided essential food, fiber, and drink. Human existence itself was a divine gift paid for with divine blood. This created a cosmic debt. Humans owed their existence to the gods, and that debt was repaid through sacrificial offerings, the most precious being human life and blood. These weren't acts of senseless violence, but transactions in a spiritual economy. The sun wouldn't rise without heart offerings. The rain wouldn't fall without tears and blood. Cosmic order required sacrifice. Different deities required different forms of sacrifice. Tlaloc, the rain god, received the tears of sacrificed children. Saipe Totec, god of spring and renewal, was honored through flaying sacrifices, with priests wearing the skins of victims to represent the new vegetation covering the earth. Huitzilopochtli, the warrior sun god, needed hearts and blood to fuel his daily journey across the sky. The methods varied accordingly. Heart extraction was common, priests using obsidian knives to cut open the chest and remove the still-beating heart, which was then burned in offering. Decapitation, flaying, arrow sacrifice, where victims were tied to a frame and shot with arrows, their flowing blood representing life-giving rain. Gladiatorial sacrifice, where captured warriors fought against elite Aztec warriors while tethered to a stone. Who was sacrificed? Primarily war captives. The Aztec flower wars were fought specifically to capture, not kill, enemy warriors for later sacrifice. But others were chosen too: slaves, children purchased for sacrifice, volunteers, yes, really, and criminals. Some were treated with reverence before death, living as deity impersonators for weeks or months, adorned in fine clothes and fed delicacies before their final moment. The scale could be staggering. At the dedication of the great temple in Tenochtitlan under Ahuitzotl in 1487, sources suggest thousands were sacrificed over 4 days. While some scholars debate these numbers as possible exaggerations, even conservative estimates indicate sacrifice occurred regularly throughout the empire. But, and this is important, human sacrifice wasn't a daily spectacle for most ordinary Aztecs. Major ceremonies involving large-scale sacrifice might occur only a few times yearly. More common were animal sacrifices, bloodletting, where individuals drew their own blood to offer, and offerings of food, flowers, incense, or precious goods. For the average person, bloodletting was the more routine experience of sacrifice. Using maguey thorns, obsidian blades, or stingray spines, people would pierce their earlobes, tongues, or genitals, collecting the blood on bark paper that was then burned. This personal offering connected individuals directly to the cosmic economy of blood and nourishment. The psychological impact of living in a society where such practices were normalized must have been profound. From childhood, Aztecs were taught that blood sustains the universe and that sacrifice was the highest duty. They witnessed ceremonies where death was ritualized and given cosmic meaning. The basic reality that humans are vulnerable mortal creatures wasn't hidden away but placed at the center of religious experience. This brings us to the broader concept of ritual violence in Aztec society. Sacrifice was just the most extreme expression of a worldview where suffering itself had spiritual value. Pain wasn't just endured, it was actively embraced as a form of communion with the divine. During major festivals, participants would undergo voluntary suffering. Priests performed extreme penances, extended fasting, sleep deprivation, extended periods of silence, and severe bloodletting that could leave them permanently scarred. Warriors and nobles participated in auto-sacrifice, drawing significant amounts of their own blood as offerings. Even children were trained early to endure ritual pain as spiritual practice. Why would anyone participate in such a system? Because within the Aztec worldview, it made perfect sense. The cosmos was precarious. The gods had died to create humans. Humans lived because divinities suffered. To keep the world from collapsing back into primordial chaos, this cycle of sacrifice had to continue. Participation wasn't just social conformity, it was existential necessity. Now, about that slavery we mentioned earlier. The Aztec system of slavery, Tlacotin, differed significantly from the hereditary chattel slavery that would later develop in colonial systems. But it was still a profound form of unfreedom. Slaves in Aztec society retained certain rights. They could marry, have children who would be born free, own property, and even own slaves themselves in some cases. Their children were always born free. Slavery wasn't hereditary. Most importantly, they had pathways to freedom. They could buy their freedom, earn it through service, have someone purchase their freedom as a charitable act, or escape to designated sanctuaries where, if they successfully evaded recapture, they could claim freedom. But make no mistake, while they had more rights than slaves in many other systems, they were still fundamentally property. They could be sold, traded, given as gifts, or sacrificed. Some were treated relatively well, while others endured brutal conditions depending entirely on their owner's character. The most common paths into slavery were revealing the complexity of the institution. Criminals could be sentenced to slavery. War captives might become slaves rather than sacrificial victims. People could sell themselves into slavery to escape debt or famine, a desperate choice that nonetheless provided survival. Parents might sell children during hard times, hoping they would at least be fed. And yes, gamblers sometimes wagered and lost their freedom in high-stakes games of patoli. Slave markets existed throughout the empire, with Azcapotzalco being particularly notorious as a center of the slave trade. Slaves were publicly displayed, often wearing specific collars, quexcotechimali, that marked their status. Prices varied depending on the slave's age, health, skills, and appearance. A robust adult male might be worth 2 mantles and 20 loads of cacao beans, a significant sum. What kinds of work did slaves perform? Primarily hard labor, carrying goods, working in construction, agricultural labor, or mining. Household slaves handled domestic chores. Some slaves with specialized skills might practice their craft for their owner's benefit. And yes, some were purchased specifically as sacrificial victims for religious ceremonies, considered a particularly prestigious offering since they represented significant economic value. The slave sacrifice connection is particularly important for understanding Aztec thinking about status and cosmic order. Most sacrifices were war captives, but for certain ceremonies, only purchased slaves were considered appropriate offerings. The distinction mattered tremendously in Aztec ritual thinking. Different ceremonies required different types of victims with specific symbolic attributes. For special sacrifices, slaves would be meticulously groomed, fed well, and treated with unusual respect before their deaths. Some were even dressed as deity impersonators, temporarily elevated to sacred status before becoming offerings. This bizarre juxtaposition, property one moment, divine the next, highlights how status in Aztec society could transform rapidly and radically depending on ritual context. Escaping slavery was possible but dangerous. The main method was reaching a royal palace and touching a special stone or vessel that symbolized sanctuary. If you made it that far without your owner catching you, you gained freedom. But if caught during escape, punishment was severe. Sometimes a wooden collar was attached that would strangle the slave if they tried to remove it. Beyond slavery, social stratification in Aztec society was complex and relatively rigid. At the top sat the Tlatoani, emperor, then the high nobility, including close royal relatives, then the broader noble class, Pipiltin, then merchants, Pocteca, then commoners, Macualtin, then servants, and finally slaves. Movement between these classes was limited but not impossible. Exceptional military service could elevate a commoner, while criminal behavior could demote a noble. Within these broad categories were numerous subclassifications and specialized roles. The professional merchant class, for instance, included long-distance traders who dealt in luxury goods, local market sellers, marketplace officials who regulated commerce, and specialized traders in particular products. Similar professional hierarchies existed for artisans, priests, warriors, and bureaucrats. The social hierarchy manifested visually through sumptuary laws, strict regulations about who could wear which clothing, ornaments, and accessories. Commoners were prohibited from wearing cotton clothing, limited to maguey fiber, jewelry made of precious materials, or certain feather decorations. The specific length of your cloak, The materials in your sandals, even the way you could wear your hair, were determined by your rank. Violating these restrictions could result in death. Looking above your station was considered a form of social counterfeiting that threatened cosmic order. Houses reflected status too. Commoners lived in simple one-room structures. Nobles enjoyed multi-room compounds with plastered walls, sometimes with second stories. The royal palace in Tenochtitlan contained hundreds of rooms, garden spaces, a personal zoo, multiple courtyards, and quarters for a small army of servants. The physical space you occupied literally measured your importance. Even in death, hierarchy continued. Nobles were typically cremated with elaborate ceremonies, while commoners were usually buried with simpler rites. The afterlife itself was stratified. The type of death determined your destination, with warriors and sacrificial victims enjoying higher status in the beyond than those who died of disease or old age. The public expression of this social order was maintained through etiquette so elaborate it would make a Victorian etiquette master sweat. When addressing nobles, commoners used specific honorific language and avoided eye contact. Physical postures, how low you bowed, whether you could sit or had to stand in someone's presence, were precisely calibrated to reflect relative status. Even your walking pace was regulated. Running in the presence of superiors was disrespectful, unless specifically commanded. Justice, as we've touched on, was similarly stratified. The same crime committed by people of different social ranks would receive dramatically different punishments. A noble caught stealing might be executed while a commoner might be enslaved. The higher status meant higher expectations and harsher consequences for failing to meet them. There were separate courts for different classes, with nobles being tried by their peers rather than by commoner judges. Yet, this rigid system coexisted with some remarkably egalitarian features. Universal education, regardless of gender or class, was virtually unheard of in ancient societies. The meritocratic aspects of military advancement meant talented commoners could rise through battlefield accomplishment. The religious concept that all humans owed the same cosmic debt created a form of spiritual equality alongside social inequality. The combination of rigid hierarchy and limited social mobility created a society constantly balancing between stability and pressure. The elevation paths for exceptional commoners provided enough possibility to prevent complete stagnation, while the strict enforcement of class markers maintained overall order. It wasn't fair by modern standards, but it was functional, at least until external pressure revealed its structural weaknesses. All of this social organization, the hierarchies, the punishments, the rituals, served the fundamental Aztec need for order in a cosmos they perceived as inherently unstable. Their mythology told them that the world had already been destroyed 4 times before the current era. The fifth sun, the current cosmic age, existed in precarious balance, constantly threatened by chaos and darkness. Without proper maintenance through sacred warfare, sacrifice, and strict social order, the world would literally end. This apocalyptic undercurrent influenced everything. The elaborate calendar systems tracked not just practical time, but the movement toward potential cosmic endings. Religious rituals weren't just traditional practices, but essential maintenance preventing universal collapse. Social conformity wasn't merely convenient but existentially necessary. Even sweeping your doorway took on cosmic significance as an act of ordering chaos. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this worldview was its strange blend of fatalism and agency. On one hand, the cosmic cycles were predetermined. the world would eventually end just as previous worlds had ended. On the other hand, human action could postpone that inevitable conclusion through proper ritual, behavior, and sacrifice. Everyone from emperor to slave participated in this grand cosmological maintenance project. This tension created a society simultaneously obsessed with order, yet plagued by cosmic anxiety. A civilization that built magnificent cities and created refined art while maintaining a constant awareness of impermanence. The shadow of potential destruction loomed over even their greatest achievements. The same hands that crafted delicate poetry and intricate featherwork also ripped out hearts to feed a hungry sun. In this context, the famous Aztec flower poems take on deeper significance. These verses, with their melancholy reflections on beauty's impermanence, weren't just poetic sentimentality, but expressions of their fundamental worldview. Even jade will shatter, even gold will crush, even Quetzal plumes will tear. One does not live forever on this earth, only for an instant do we endure. When the Spanish arrived with their radically different cosmic understanding, linear time, eternal salvation, single deity, the collision wasn't just military or political, but profoundly metaphysical. Two fundamentally incompatible ways of seeing reality competed for dominance. And in this clash, the European cosmic model had one significant tactical advantage. It hadn't required the systematic development of mass human sacrifice. The terror and glory of the Aztec world emerged from a civilization trying desperately to hold back darkness, literally to keep the sun rising each morning, through a complex system of sacred violence, social control, and cosmic maintenance. To modern sensibilities, many of their practices are horrifying. To them, the alternative, cosmic collapse, was far worse. So when you walked those ancient streets, sweeping your doorway, performing your designated tasks, observing the strict codes of behavior, you weren't just following arbitrary rules. You were, in your small way, helping to prevent the apocalypse. Your daily actions either contributed to order or invited chaos. Nothing was neutral. Nothing was merely personal. Everything you did rippled through the cosmic fabric. In this light, the extreme punishments make a certain terrible sense. Someone who violated social norms wasn't just breaking arbitrary rules, but undermining the very structure that kept the universe functioning. Their punishment served as both cosmic repair and public warning. The individual mattered less than the system they had destabilized. As night falls on our exploration of Aztec life, perhaps the most important takeaway is this: the Aztecs weren't simply bloodthirsty or arbitrarily cruel. They were participants in a cosmic drama where the stakes were literally universal. Their strict codes, their elaborate rituals, their dramatic punishments, and yes, their sacrifices, all served what they understood as the greatest possible good, the continuation of existence itself. Whether you find their worldview fascinating or horrifying, probably both, recognizing its internal logic helps us see past the sensationalized aspects of their civilization to the complex human reality beneath. A society of people who, like us, were trying to make sense of an often chaotic universe but developed radically different answers about how best to survive in it. On that somber note, let's move forward. We've glimpsed the shadows. Now it's time to explore the specific machinery of justice that kept this intricate social order functioning. The laws, the courts, the punishments that turned cosmic theory into daily practice. Chapter 4. Welcome back. If you're still here, you've survived a full day in the Aztec Empire, plus a rather unsettling peek behind the curtain of glory. And now it's time for a bedtime story, a long one, about crime. Not just any crime, Aztec crime. And more importantly, what happened to you when you got caught? Spoiler alert, it wasn't a stern warning and a fine. This was justice with feathers, fire, and a bit of flair. Let's begin slowly, like all good cautionary tales do. Maybe you're just a guy who cut down a tree, a sacred tree. Not that you knew it was sacred, you just needed firewood. It was a little scrawny, leaning weirdly to the left, practically asking to be chopped. So you chopped, and now you're about to be the star of today's Temple Plaza programming. You see, in the Aztec Empire, some laws were written and others were just known, deeply, culturally, universally. Like, don't lie to the elders, or don't touch the jaguar priest's headdress. Or, yes, don't chop that particular tree that stands near a shrine to Tlaloc, god of rain, whose mood swings were legendary. Crime in the Aztec world wasn't always about morality, it was about balance. Social, cosmic, spiritual. Break a rule, and you didn't just insult your neighbor, you risked tipping the universe into chaos. Which is impressive when you think about it. One guy, one axe, and suddenly it's end of the world territory. High stakes firewood. Underscore. 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 So what did the legal process look like? Surprisingly organized. No powdered wigs, but plenty of structure. Courts in the Aztec Empire ranged from your local Tlaitocan village court to the high courts of Tenochtitlan. There were laws, codes, trained judges. There were appeals, not always successful, but technically there. And the system? Based heavily on the Huehuetlatolli, the words of the elders. Ancient sayings passed down and compiled into codes that were half law, half moral guidebook. If you committed a crime, you were brought before a group of stern-looking judges, often nobles or priests. They wore cloaks, they sat on mats, and they had very good memories for who had already committed which offense. Evidence mattered. Witnesses, too, but so did your reputation. If you were already known as that guy who steals maize, you didn't get a lot of benefit of the doubt. Sometimes your fate was sealed the moment you stepped onto the trial platform. Your punishment? Always public, always symbolic, and always memorable? Let's take a stroll through some of the more theatrical examples, shall we? Underscore. Underscore 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 underscore. 1. Theft. Let's say you stole something. Not a crown jewel, just a nice gourd, or a basket of corn, or maybe some smoked fish from the market. First offense? You'd be publicly shamed, maybe shaved bald, painted black, forced to wear torn clothes and paraded around while someone announced your crime, loudly, possibly with a drum. Everyone would know, including your mother. Second offense? Slavery, not a metaphor, actual servitude to the person you wronged. Third offense? Flaying, slowly, in public, with the skin sometimes worn by a priest during a ceremony. Because why just punish when you can teach a cosmic lesson about consequences and epidermis? underscore 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 underscore. 2. Adultery. Romance was dangerous. In the Aztec world, marriage was sacred, not just emotionally, but politically and cosmically. So if you cheated, that was a capital crime. Men could be clubbed to death with a macuahuitl, a weapon that was part sword, part nightmare. Women, strangled or thrown off a cliff. And if you tried to lie your way out of it, well, now you're guilty of perjury and adultery. Double the trouble. Double the doom. False accusations were also punished. You couldn't just cry infidelity for fun. Lie, and you might be executed yourself. Justice cut both ways, with obsidian. Underscore 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 underscore. 3. Laziness. Yes, laziness. Doing nothing could get you punished. The Aztecs believed work was sacred. Everyone had a role to play. Refusing to contribute was more than personal failure. It was cosmic sabotage, punishment, public shaming, maybe wearing rags, maybe dragging a bundle of firewood through the streets while people shouted, "Look, the man who does nothing!" Repeat offenders, whipping, or slavery. Or being sent to a house of correction, which was a bit like a military camp, only with more chili smoke and less supervision. Underscore, 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 underscore. Underscore 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 underscore. 4. Drunkenness for youth. Adults could drink pulque, a fermented drink with ceremonial and social use. But teens? Absolutely not. Caught drunk underage? You might be shaved, paraded naked, or worse, executed, not just to punish you, but to scare everyone else. It worked. Nothing sobers a neighborhood like a teenager on display, regretting their second cup. Underscore, 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 underscore. Underscore 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 underscore. 5. Lying in court. Justice depended on truth. So if you lied in court, you could be executed, or have your lips stained with charcoal, or paraded with a sign that said, essentially, liar for hire. The message, lies break the fabric of society, and your lips are now proof. Underscore, 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 underscore. 6. Children. Children weren't exempt from punishment. quite the opposite. If a child disrespected a parent or refused to obey, they might be placed in a hut filled with burning chili smoke, pricked with cactus spines, forced to sweep temple floors barefoot. These punishments weren't random cruelty. They were designed to instill discipline, to remind young Aztecs that responsibility didn't start when you turned 18. It started when you could walk. Even noble children were held to high standards, maybe higher. A prince caught slacking might be sent to live like a commoner, or worse, sent to a temple school where discipline was the main subject. Underscore 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 underscore. And let's not forget the role of the community in all this. Justice wasn't hidden behind doors. It was street theater, designed to teach, warn, and entertain. Everyone watched. Everyone remembered. You didn't just carry your punishment, you became the punishment. Flayed thieves, drunk teens, cactus-scratched delinquents, each one a moving parable with limbs. And the result? A society that ran on fear, structure, and the deep belief that actions ripple through the cosmos. So next time you think about sneaking an extra pastry or skipping work, just remember, you could be bald, painted black, and explaining yourself to an angry priest. Sleep well, dear listener, because in the Aztec Empire, even bedtime could be a legal matter. Let's dive a bit deeper into the Aztec legal system that made those dramatic punishments possible. Because behind the theatrical executions and public shamings was something surprisingly sophisticated. A multi-tiered court system that might make you reconsider just how primitive this civilization really was. The Aztec legal structure began at the neighborhood level with the Calpulli courts. Think of the Calpulli as something between an extended family clan and a neighborhood association, a local unit that largely regulated its own affairs. Each Calpulli had its own council of respected elders who handled minor disputes, petty crimes, and local regulations. This was justice at its most intimate. Your judges knew your parents, your work habits, and probably that embarrassing thing you did during last year's harvest festival. Cases too complex for the Calpulli court moved upward to city courts, presided over by magistrates appointed from the noble class. These Tecutli judges underwent specialized training and served fixed terms. They weren't just random elites playing at jurisprudence. They actually studied legal precedents, memorized traditional codes, and developed expertise in specific areas of law. At the highest level sat the supreme courts in major cities, with Tenochtitlan's court being the ultimate authority. The Tlaxitlan, place of judgment, held sessions every 80 days in the royal palace, with separate chambers for civil cases, criminal matters, and military affairs. A wronged party could appeal a lower court's decision here, though doing so carried risk. If your appeal was deemed frivolous, you might face punishment yourself. The emperor himself served as the final court of appeal, personally hearing the most difficult or significant cases 4 times each year. Imagine having your parking dispute potentially escalated all the way to the living embodiment of divine authority. Though, to be fair, the cases that reached the Tlatoani typically involved matters of state importance, noble criminals, or situations where lower courts couldn't reach consensus. Court procedures followed established protocols. Sessions began with ritual purification and prayers, justice being sacred business. Defendants and witnesses gave statements, Evidence was presented. Judges could call on court officials to investigate claims by interviewing additional witnesses or examining crime scenes. In complex cases, multiple judges would hear evidence and deliberate together before rendering a verdict. The most remarkable aspect? Almost everything was oral. In a society with written language but no widespread literacy, court proceedings relied heavily on memory and verbal testimony. Records were kept, but primarily for unusual cases that might establish precedents. This oral tradition meant judges needed exceptional recall and understanding of legal principles rather than the ability to consult written codes. Legal advocates existed, a sort of primitive attorney class who specialized in presenting cases according to traditional forms. These tepantlatuani, speakers for others, weren't technically lawyers in the modern sense, but had specialized knowledge of procedure and rhetoric. They particularly assisted those who might struggle to present their own cases effectively: the young, the elderly, those with speech difficulties, and what about those laws themselves? While no complete Aztec legal code survives, we have substantial knowledge from Spanish accounts and remaining fragments. The basic structure combined written law, oral tradition, and religious principles. Laws governed everything from property rights and commercial transactions to family relations and religious obligations. Property law was sophisticated enough to recognize multiple types of ownership. Land could be held by individuals, families, neighborhoods, calpuli, nobles, the state, or temples, each with different rights and restrictions. Water rights, fishing access, and forest usage all had specific regulations. Boundary disputes were common enough to warrant specialized judges with expertise in property matters. Contract law existed too, governing everything from marriage agreements to commercial partnerships. Contracts could be verbal for smaller matters or formalized with witnesses, and sometimes written documentation for significant transactions. Breaking contracts carried penalties ranging from financial compensation to public shaming or even enslavement in extreme cases. Family law regulated marriage, divorce, inheritance, and child-rearing. Marriage required formal consent from both parties and their families, with specific property arrangements depending on social class. Divorce was possible but regulated, with property and child custody determined according to fault and circumstances. Children had legally recognized rights but also strictly enforced obligations to parents and community. Criminal law, as we've seen, covered a vast range of offenses with punishment scales increasing with repetition. But the Aztec concept of crime differed fundamentally from modern Western concepts. While some offenses, theft, murder, assault, would be recognizable to us as crimes, others, ritual impropriety, laziness, disrespect to elders, reflected the unique Aztec emphasis on social harmony and cosmic order. This brings us to another fascinating aspect of Aztec law: the concept of collective responsibility. In some cases, punishment extended beyond the individual offender to their family or even entire neighborhood. If a noble committed a serious crime, their family might be stripped of rank and privileges. If a community harbored a fugitive, the whole group could face sanctions. This collective dimension reflected the Aztec view that crime wasn't just an individual moral failing, but a tear in the social fabric that affected everyone. Your actions reflected on your family and community, and they shared responsibility for your behavior. This created powerful social pressure toward conformity and self-regulation. Your neighbors had very personal reasons to ensure you behaved properly. The Aztec system distinguished between intentional crimes, accidental harms, and negligence, with different punishments for each category. motivation mattered. A theft motivated by genuine starvation might be treated more leniently than one driven by greed. Killing in legitimate self-defense carried lesser consequences than premeditated murder. Accidents could still require compensation to victims, but might avoid the stigma and severe penalties of intentional wrongdoing. Age was considered too. Children below a certain age, typically around 10, weren't held fully responsible for crimes but were subject to corrective discipline administered by parents or schools. Adolescents faced intermediate penalties, sometimes involving those chilly smoke chambers we mentioned earlier. The elderly occasionally received mitigated punishments based on their age and status, particularly for minor offenses. What about evidence standards? More sophisticated than you might expect. Aztec courts distinguished between eyewitness testimony, the gold standard, circumstantial evidence, and hearsay, considered less reliable. Physical evidence was examined. In disputed cases involving land, judges might visit the property personally. For commercial disputes, witnesses to the original transaction were crucial. False testimony was severely punished, creating strong incentives for truthfulness. Perhaps most fascinating were the provisions for what we might call temporary insanity. The Aztecs recognized that extreme intoxication, certain medical conditions, or powerful emotional states could impair judgment. Someone who committed a crime while beside themselves with grief or under the influence of particular plants might receive modified punishment if the impairment was considered legitimate and temporary. The intertwining of law and religion created some unique legal concepts. Some crimes were primarily offenses against social order, while others constituted direct affronts to deities. This distinction affected both procedure and punishment. Ordinary theft might be handled by civil authorities, but stealing from a temple brought religious authorities into the process and often resulted in more severe, spiritually oriented penalties. Temples themselves functioned as sanctuaries in limited cases. Someone fleeing punishment could temporarily claim protection within sacred precincts, though this typically only delayed rather than prevented justice. The gods might grant you temporary refuge, but eventually, cosmic balance required resolution. One particularly interesting feature was how the system handled disputed facts when evidence was inconclusive. In some cases, rivals might undergo ritual ordeals or competitive tests to determine truth. These weren't quite the European trial by fire, but involved regulated challenges that supposedly revealed divine favor toward the truthful party. In others, ritual specialists might use divination to supplement insufficient evidence, consulting omens, casting lots, or interpreting signs to determine guilt. Aztec legal principles emphasized restoration and deterrence more than retribution for its own sake. Many punishments included restitution to victims alongside public consequences for offenders. A thief might return stolen goods or their equivalent value, perform service for the wronged party, and endure public shaming. The goal was both to make the victim whole and to prevent similar future offenses through vivid example. For minor first offenses, particularly among ordinary citizens with good reputations, warnings were sometimes sufficient. Judges could choose to administer stern public reprimands rather than tangible punishments, putting offenders on notice that further transgressions would bring escalating consequences. This graduated approach resembled modern progressive discipline, though it escalated much more rapidly toward severe outcomes. The relationship between social class and punishment was complex. In some ways, nobles faced harsher consequences. Higher standards applied to those with greater privilege and responsibility. A commoner might be fined for a minor offense where a noble would be publicly humiliated. A commoner who committed a serious crime might be enslaved, while a noble guilty of the same offense could face execution. The reasoning was clear. Those with greater knowledge and status should know better. Yet in other ways, class privilege operated similarly to modern systems. Nobles were tried in separate courts by their peers, not by commoner judges. They had better access to legal advocates. Their connections and resources could sometimes influence outcomes. Punishment methods often reflected status. Nobles might be strangled privately rather than publicly flayed, maintaining a certain dignity even in execution. Military service created another dimension in the justice system. Warriors with distinguished records might receive more lenient treatment for certain offenses, reflecting their value to the state. Active military campaigns sometimes led to temporary amnesty for imprisoned offenders willing to serve, a second chance through combat service. Eagle and Jaguar warriors, the elite military orders, had their own courts and specific legal privileges reflecting their prestigious position. The Aztec legal system evolved over time. It wasn't static. Earlier periods showed greater influence from previous Mesoamerican traditions like those of Teotihuacan or the Toltecs. Later codifications under specific rulers like Nezahualcoyotl of Texcoco, often called the lawgiver, created more standardized approaches across the Triple Alliance territories. By the time of Spanish contact, the system had developed considerable sophistication and regional consistency. Speaking of Nezahualcoyotl, this remarkable ruler deserves special mention in any discussion of Aztec justice. As the ruler of Texcoco, one of the 3 cities in the Aztec Triple Alliance, he created a legal code so comprehensive and advanced that even the Spanish grudgingly expressed admiration. His 80 laws organized crimes into categories, established consistent punishment scales, reformed court procedures, and limited arbitrary applications of authority. Think of him as the Aztec Hammurabi, only with more feathers and an even more dramatic name. For all its sophistication, the Aztec legal system certainly had elements we would consider problematic. Torture was used to extract confessions. Class and gender influenced outcomes. Religious beliefs could trump factual evidence. Punishments often seemed disproportionately harsh by modern standards. Yet compared to contemporary 15th century European justice systems with their own torture, witch trials, and public executions, Aztec courts were not obviously more brutal or less rational. Different, certainly. More colorful, definitely, but not necessarily less developed. Now, let's move from the abstract structure to the visceral reality. What did Aztec justice actually look like in practice? Let's walk through the process for our hypothetical tree cutter who unwisely harvested firewood from a sacred site. First, the discovery. Perhaps a priest notices the missing branches during morning rituals, or a devout neighbor witnessed the cutting and reports it, fearing collective punishment will fall on the community. Temple guards are dispatched. Evidence is gathered, fresh cuts on the sacred tree, wood of matching type found at the suspect's home. Witnesses are questioned. Was this an intentional desecration or ignorant mistake? First offense or repeat sacrilege? The accused is brought before the local Kalpuli court. He stands on a reed mat. No fancy defendant's table here. The charges are announced formally. Witnesses speak. The accused offers defense. Perhaps he claims ignorance of the tree's sacred status. Perhaps he admits guilt but pleads necessity. His family was cold, no other wood was available. The judges confer, consulting both legal precedent and religious authority about the severity of the offense. If it's truly a first-time mistake made from ignorance, he might escape with public reprimand and mandatory offerings to the offended deity. If evidence suggests deliberate disrespect or repeated offenses, punishment escalates dramatically. The judgment is announced publicly, with explanations connecting the offense to cosmic order and community well-being. For a mid-level offense, punishment might unfold like this. The offender's head is shaved, a visible mark of shame. He's dressed in rough maguey fiber garments instead of cotton, another status reduction. A rope is secured around his neck, and he's led through public areas while a crier announces his crime. At each neighborhood entrance, he stops while the announcement is repeated. He carries branches similar to those he cut unlawfully, symbolically connecting punishment to crime. After this procession, he performs ritual restitution, planting new trees, making offerings, performing labor service at the temple he offended. His family might participate in cleansing rituals to remove the spiritual contamination of his actions. The community observes all of this, a living lesson about respecting sacred boundaries. For more serious cases, particularly those involving direct religious offenses, repeat crimes, or noble offenders, the matter might be referred upward to city courts, or even the Supreme Court at Tenochtitlan. There, the process would be more formal, the judges more numerous, the potential consequences more severe. The punishment archive, what we might call the Aztecs' greatest hits of creative justice, includes far more elaborate scenarios than our simple tree-cutting case. Let's explore a few more, shall we? For corrupt judges who accepted bribes, the penalty was particularly fitting. They would be publicly stripped of their insignia of office, their special mantle torn away, their judgment seat destroyed before their eyes. After this symbolic destruction of their authority, they faced execution, usually by strangulation rather than more gruesome methods, a final nod to their former status. For boundary disputes involving fraudulent claims, offenders might be forced to walk the disputed perimeter wearing distinctive markers of shame, literally tracing the lines of their dishonesty before the community. Sometimes their ears were cut, removing not just physical flesh but the spiritual essence of someone who refused to properly hear the truth about property boundaries. For theft from markets, a particularly serious offense given the sacred nature of commerce, unique punishments applied. Market thieves might have their hands bound to their neck with rope, forcing them into a perma-slouch position embodying shame. They would be paraded through the marketplace they violated, a warning to all traders and shoppers. Repeat offenders might have their hands crushed with clubs, a direct connection between offense and body part. For impersonating a tax collector or other official, essentially ancient identity theft, offenders might be slowly strangled in public while tax records were burned before them. The message was clear. Pretending to be a state authority undermined the entire social structure and created cosmic imbalance that required dramatic correction. Sexual crimes received particularly harsh treatment. Beyond the adultery penalties we've mentioned, there were elaborate punishments for various forms of sexual misconduct. Those guilty of rape might have sharp sticks inserted into their bodily orifices before execution, a grim symmetry. Same-sex relations had complex status. In some contexts they were tolerated, while in others, particularly involving elite males who were expected to produce heirs. They could result in death. Incest taboos were strictly enforced, with punishment severity varying based on the exact relationship involved. The most forbidden unions, typically those between parents and children or full siblings, could result in strangulation, hanging, or burning alive. More distant relatives who violated incest boundaries might face lesser but still severe consequences. Public indecency, exposing oneself inappropriately or engaging in sexual acts in sacred or communal spaces, might earn the offender a one-way trip to the chilly smoke hut we've mentioned several times. Imagine the world's most painful sauna, where burning chili peppers created eye-watering, lung-scorching smoke that literally brought offenders to tears. This punishment was considered spiritually cleansing, the harsh smoke purging moral contamination along with a significant portion of your respiratory comfort. The fascinating case of military discipline deserves special attention. Warriors who failed in battle or broke military rules faced specialized punishments designed to attack their identity as fighters. Their warrior insignia might be destroyed. Their distinctive hairstyles, crucial markers of rank and accomplishment, could be cut off. In extreme cases, they might be dressed as women, a gender inversion that, in the Aztec gender paradigm, represented the ultimate status loss for a male warrior. These identity-based punishments often proved more devastating than physical pain. Economic crimes like market fraud, weights tampering, or contract violations had their own punishment scales. First offenses might result in fines and public reprimand. Repeat offenders could see their trading privileges suspended or their market stalls destroyed. Persistent violators might be banned from commerce entirely. An economic death sentence in a society where trade networks were often hereditary and represented generations of family investment. What about murder? Intentional killing was typically punished by death, usually through a method that mirrored the original crime. Kill someone with a macuajito? Prepare to meet one yourself. Poison a rival? You might be forced to consume a similar substance. The symmetry wasn't just poetic justice, but cosmic rebalancing. The world set right through parallel action. Some crimes were considered so severe they transformed the offender's very nature. Treason against the state, major temple desecration, or attempting to impersonate divine entities fell into this category. These weren't just violations of law, but perversions of cosmic order. Offenders became tlahtololti, literally damaged people whose corruption was deemed fundamental. For them, punishment wasn't simple death, but total erasure. Execution, property confiscation, family dishonor, and sometimes the literal removal of their names from records. They didn't just die. They were unmade. The enforcement officers who carried out these creative sentences weren't quite police in the modern sense. Quauhnachtli, eagle cactus fruit, served as official messengers, witnesses, and executioners for the highest courts. Temple guards monitored religious sites and enforced sacred regulations. Market officials supervised commercial spaces. At the neighborhood level, rotating watchmen maintained order. The militaristic nature of Aztec society meant that in crisis situations, warriors could be quickly mobilized as a security force. Prisons existed but served different functions than modern incarceration. The Quacali, or Eagle House, held prisoners temporarily while awaiting trial or punishment. Some offenders were confined in wooden cages, not as the primary punishment but as a holding method before execution or sacrifice. Long-term imprisonment as a punishment itself was rare. The Aztec system preferred immediate, visible consequences rather than extended isolation. For all its theatrical brutality, the Aztec justice system contained surprising elements of rehabilitation for minor offenders. First-time youth offenders often received corrective discipline rather than permanent punishment. Specialized houses of correction existed where young troublemakers received strict training, moral education, and practical skills. The goal wasn't just to punish, but to reintegrate useful members into society, though the methods would certainly violate modern human rights standards. One punishment notably absent from the Aztec repertoire: mutilation as a permanent marker. Unlike many ancient systems that routinely cut off hands, feet, ears, or noses as lasting punishments, the Aztecs rarely imposed permanent physical alterations on criminals. Temporary markings, paint, specific haircuts, special clothing were common, but these eventually faded, allowing potential rehabilitation. The permanent nature of the punishment was in the memory of witnesses, not necessarily in the body of the offender, unless, of course, the punishment was death. The public nature of punishment served multiple purposes. Most obviously, it provided deterrence through vivid example. Nothing discourages theft like watching a repeat offender suffer the consequences up close. It also reinforced social bonds by creating shared experiences and collective memory. Punishment became community theater with moral messaging, a spectacle that everyone witnessed and discussed, reinforcing shared values with each performance. This public dimension extended beyond the punishment itself to include reconciliation and reintegration when possible. After serving their sentence, minor offenders might undergo public cleansing rituals that symbolically removed their crime stain and allowed community acceptance. These ceremonies created closure for both the offender and the social group, a formal recognition that justice had been served and balance restored. The cosmic theater of Aztec justice culminated most dramatically in cases tied directly to religious offenses. When someone violated major religious taboos, desecrating sacred objects, impersonating deities, interfering with ceremonies, punishment often mirrored ritual sacrifice. The distinction between criminal execution and religious offering blurred, with the offender's death reframed as unwilling participation in the cosmic maintenance they had disrupted. This brings us to perhaps the most distinctive feature of the entire Aztec justice system, its performance aspect. Punishments weren't just practically effective, they were dramatically compelling. They told stories, they used costumes, props, and scripted elements. They created memorable spectacles that lingered in community memory long after the specific offense might have been forgotten. The condemned thief painted black and paraded through streets. The adulteress with her garments torn, hair cut, body decorated with symbolic ash. The corrupt official stripped of his insignia before his peers. The boundary violator walking the very lines he falsified. Each punishment created a visual narrative connecting offense to consequence in ways even illiterate observers could understand and remember. This dramatic quality served practical purposes in a society without widespread literacy or permanent record-keeping. Laws maintained through oral tradition required regular reinforcement. Public punishments weren't just addressing individual crimes, but constantly reteaching the legal code itself through vivid example. Each execution, shaming ritual, or dramatic penalty reinforced specific principles for the watching crowd. The psychological impact of such a system must have been profound. Everyone was both performer and audience in this legal theater. Today you might watch your neighbor suffer for stealing. Tomorrow the community might watch you suffer for lying. The constant reminder of consequences created powerful internalized restraints, not just fear of punishment, but fear of public shame before everyone you knew. Perhaps most striking to modern sensibilities is how this entire elaborate system functioned without police forces, massive prison complexes, or extensive written codes. Social pressure, religious authority, and theatrical consequences combined to maintain order without the institutional infrastructure we consider essential for justice today. Was it effective? The historical record suggests it was remarkably so. Spanish accounts describe Tenochtitlan as having lower crime rates than contemporary European cities, despite its enormous size and population density. The combination of clear consequences, consistent enforcement, strong community monitoring, and universal moral education created a society where major crimes were relatively rare. Of course, this effectiveness came at considerable cost to individual freedoms and humane treatment by modern standards. The system prioritized cosmic order and social harmony over individual rights or proportional justice. It created stability through terror as much as through fairness. It was effective but often cruel, sophisticated but frequently brutal. As we conclude our tour through the strange landscape of Aztec justice, perhaps the most important takeaway is recognizing it as neither primitive brutality nor idealized wisdom, but as a complex system developed by a sophisticated civilization to address universal human problems of order, fairness, and accountability. Different from our approach, certainly, harsh by our standards, undoubtedly, but ultimately a mirror reflecting how another society answered the same questions all legal systems must address. How do we live together? What happens when rules break down? How do we restore balance when harm occurs? So the next time you complain about a speeding ticket or jury duty, perhaps take a moment to appreciate that at least you're not standing in a plaza, painted black, with a priest approaching and an audience gathering for the show. Sometimes a fine and some community service doesn't seem so bad after all. If you're still with me, eyes half closed, face squished against your pillow, dreaming of maize and chili smoke, then good. You're in the perfect condition to float gently through some of the most dramatic, strange, and somehow still soothing historical events that defined Aztec law and order. 1. The Emperor's drunken son. Imagine being the crown prince. Next in line, royal blood, silk cloaks, and the best pulque money can ferment. Now imagine getting caught drinking that pulque before the gods, and the law said you were old enough. That's what happened to one unfortunate young noble, a son of the emperor. And unlike in modern teen dramas, this didn't end with grounding or losing access to his obsidian iPhone. Instead, the prince was paraded before the court. His head was shaved, his fine clothes stripped away. He was made to sweep the temple floors in rags like a common servant. And this wasn't behind closed doors. It was out in the plaza, where everyone could watch the emperor's own son scrub away his shame. Lesson? In the Aztec Empire, the law was the law, even if your dad wore a feathered headdress and spoke for the gods. Underscore, 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 underscore. 2. The merchant who lied. In the market city of Tlatelolco, a man once tried to sell dyed turkey feathers as rare Quetzal plumes. Now to you or me, this might sound like a minor act of fraud, a bit like passing off polyester as silk. Annoying, sure, but not exactly life-threatening, but in the Aztec world, this was a breach of sacred commerce. The market was protected by the gods, and lying under their gaze was unwise. He was caught, publicly, dragged from his stall. His goods were scattered, his hands tied, and the judges ordered him painted black, the color of deceit. He walked the market in shame. Everyone knew. No one would trust his feathers or his face again. Underscore 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 underscore. 3. The high priest who took a bribe. This one's heavier. And yes, even the priests were not immune to the system they upheld. A high-ranking judge-priest, respected, decorated, and absolutely convinced of his own wisdom, was accused of taking a bribe. Someone whispered. Evidence surfaced. Witnesses came forward. He stood trial, not in secret chambers, but in full view. The emperor himself attended, and the sentence? Death. Not exile, not a slap on the wrist, not even a chance to think about what you've done. Because the Aztecs believed that a corrupt judge didn't just fail a person, he endangered the cosmic order. The priest was executed at the foot of the temple, his robes burned, his name struck from the records. Harsh? Yes, but in Aztec eyes, justice was sacred, and no one, not even the guardians of law, could afford to poison it. Underscore 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 underscore. 4. The adulterous couple. A man, a woman, a moment of passion. Unfortunately, the woman was married, and the Aztecs were not big on soap opera plotlines. They were caught, maybe by a neighbor, maybe by divine misfortune. Either way, they were hauled before the court. The punishment? Public execution? But here's the thing. Sometimes, if the husband chose, he could carry it out himself, with a club, a real one. No legal fees, no custody battle, just a very permanent expression of displeasure. The lovers met their end at dusk, not in secret, not with mercy, but with ceremony. Their names remembered only as a warning. Underscore 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 underscore. 5. The thief who was skinned. He stole once, got punished, stole again, was enslaved. But on the third offense, they flayed him. Yes, really. His skin was removed, not just as punishment, but as a message. In some cases, priests even wore the skin temporarily as part of a religious rite, symbolizing rebirth and the return of cosmic balance. This wasn't just justice, it was theater. It was warning, it was cosmic recycling, Aztec style. And that image, gruesome as it is, lingered in the minds of everyone who ever thought of stealing again. Underscore 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 underscore. 6. The farmer who cut the wrong tree. He needed firewood. He had an axe. He saw a tree. Unfortunately, that tree was sacred, planted near a shrine, under the protection of the gods. He chopped it. Maybe just a few branches, maybe the whole trunk. Either way, the gods weren't pleased, and neither were the neighbors. His punishment was poetic. Beaten with thorny branches, paraded through the town, forced to offer goods and labor in restitution, and his house burned. Because if you couldn't respect the roots of the world, you didn't deserve your own. Underscore, 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 underscore. And there you have it, a gallery of consequences. A museum of moral messages, all delivered in tones of blood, smoke, and feathers. No need to remember the names, just the feeling. Just the soft certainty that in the Aztec Empire, justice wasn't whispered. It was sung. It was performed. It echoed through the plazas and into the dreams of children who knew better than to sneak pulque before their time. And now, as the firelight flickers behind your closed eyes, let's slip quietly onward toward the end of this strange and beautiful legal lullaby. But before we drift away from these tales, let's linger a moment longer with each of these characters, following them through the full ceremonial arc of their fates. For in Aztec justice, the end was never quick. It was a process, a performance with multiple acts, each building toward the final cosmic statement. The emperor's son, let's call him Cuauhtémoc, though his real name has faded into history, didn't just face a single day of humiliation. His punishment unfolded over weeks, carefully choreographed to maximize both the lesson and the restoration. After the initial public shaming and head shaving, he was sent to live among commoner households, moving every few days to experience different levels of ordinary life. He fetched water from public fountains, feeling the weight of clay jugs on shoulders accustomed only to ceremonial cloaks. He ground maize until his noble hands blistered and bled. He slept on rough mats in smoky single-room homes, eating simple meals with families who watched him with a mixture of awe and trepidation. How does one behave with an imperial son sent to learn humility in your home? Do you offer him the best portion? Treat him like any other youth? The social awkwardness alone was a form of punishment. Each night, priests would visit his temporary quarters, requiring him to recite verses from the Huehuetlatoli, ancestral wisdom teachings about moderation, proper behavior, and respect for cosmic order. Any mistakes meant starting again from the beginning, regardless of the late hour. Sleep came only after perfect recitation. At dawn, he joined other youths in ritual cleansing, but with a difference. His water was deliberately colder, his position always last. Small reminders that his royal blood now earned him no privileges. In the Telpochcali youth house, instructors assigned him the most unpleasant tasks, cleaning latrines, carrying the heaviest loads, serving others during meals. This continued until the next major festival, when his father, the living embodiment of divine authority, publicly evaluated his transformation. Had he learned true humility? Did he understand the sacred responsibility of high birth? Only after a tearful public confession, ritual bloodletting from his ears and tongue, and ceremonial reacceptance by representatives of the offended deities was he permitted to begin the slow process of status restoration. First came the renewal of his head, hair allowed to grow back, no longer a visible mark of shame. Then new clothing appropriate to a chastened but rehabilitated noble youth. Finally, the careful restructuring of his education, now focused intensely on law, religious obligation, and the cosmic consequences of disorder. His drinking offense became the defining moment of his life, transforming him from entitled prince to cautionary example, his very name becoming a whispered warning to other noble children tempted by pulque before their time. Years later, when he finally took his place among the adult nobility, the story of his youthful transgression remained part of his identity, mentioned in formal introductions, depicted in pictographic records, a permanent footnote to his otherwise accomplished life. The Aztec world never truly forgot or fully forgave, but it did reintegrate those who survived their punishment and absorbed its lessons. As for our merchant with his counterfeit Quetzal feathers, the full scope of his punishment reveals much about the Aztec concept of commercial ethics. After his initial public humiliation in the marketplace, painted black with his fraudulent goods destroyed before him, he faced a complex set of restoration requirements. First came material restitution. He was required to compensate anyone he had defrauded, plus additional payments representing damage to their trust. But beyond these practical matters came symbolic rebalancing. For an entire market cycle, he was prohibited from selling anything. Instead, he served as a burden carrier for other merchants, transporting their legitimate goods while wearing a special marker of his status as a convicted fraudster. During major market days, he stood at the entrance to Tlatelolco Marketplace beside a display of both genuine Quetzal feathers and the turkey feathers he had used in his deception. As shoppers entered, he was required to call out his own crime, explain how to identify authentic luxury goods, and warn about the cosmic dangers of commercial dishonesty. He became, in essence, an anti-fraud educational exhibit. His family business suffered enormously. In the communal Aztec trading system, reputation was literal capital. His children found marriage prospects diminished, his trading partners distanced themselves, his position in the merchant hierarchy permanently lowered. Yet the system offered a path, narrow and difficult, back to legitimate commerce. After completing his public penance, he could gradually rebuild, starting with the humblest goods. No luxury items, nothing requiring special trust. Each successful, honest transaction slowly restored his standing. Market judges monitored his activities with special scrutiny. Any hint of further dishonesty would result in permanent expulsion from commercial life. A devastating sentence in a society where professions were often hereditary and represented generations of specialized knowledge. Years later, in his old age, he had managed a partial rehabilitation, never returning to his former status, but achieving a modest position selling practical goods with his adult son, who inherited both his father's skills and the heavy burden of his damaged name. The story of his fraudulent feathers became part of market lore, told to young merchant apprentices as warning against the temptation of easy profit through deception. The corrupt high priest story continued beyond his execution as well, though in a different way. His punishment didn't end with physical death, but extended into memory and legacy, what we might call reputational annihilation. After his strangulation at the temple steps, a relatively dignified execution method reserved for high-status offenders, the systematic erasure began. His name was physically removed from temple records, scraped from stone, burned from painted deerskin codices, deliberately omitted from oral recitations of priestly lineages. His possessions were either destroyed or redistributed, depending on their nature. Sacred items returned to temple custody, valuable goods distributed to those he had wronged. Personal items burned in purification rituals designed to cleanse the spiritual contamination of corruption. His family faced complex consequences. They weren't punished directly for his crimes. Aztec justice generally recognized individual rather than inherited guilt, but they suffered the practical aftermath of his disgrace. His sons lost positions or opportunities. His daughters faced marriage difficulties. His wife returned to her birth family, often adopting her maiden identity to escape association with corruption. Most significantly, his case became a ceremonial reference point. During the installation of new judge priests, his story was recited as warning. Candidates for judicial office were taken to view the spot where he died, required to meditate on the cosmic responsibility of their position. In yearly purification ceremonies, his corrupt acts were symbolically cleansed from the temple grounds, not named directly as his name was erased, but referenced obliquely as the great betrayal of trust. In this way, his physical punishment was just the beginning of a much longer process of social hygiene, removing the spiritual contamination of corruption from the cosmic order while transforming his individual failing into institutional memory. He died once but continued to serve justice for generations as cautionary example and ritual reference point. The adulterous couple met a fate that reveals the complex gender and status dimensions of Aztec justice. While both faced execution, the manner differed significantly based on both gender and class. The woman, let's imagine her as a merchant's wife of middle status, faced strangulation. The man, perhaps a warrior of similar rank, faced clubbing. Their executions were scheduled simultaneously, but in different locations, preventing any final communication or connection. Before execution, both underwent ritual preparation. The woman's hair was cut and burned, her finery removed, her body painted with symbols of her transgression, patterns representing broken bonds and cosmic disorder. The man was stripped of any military insignia, his warrior hairstyle shorn, his body marked with similar symbolic patterns. If children were involved, a special ceremony determined their fate. Offspring of the legitimate marriage remained with the wronged spouse, undergoing purification rituals to remove the spiritual contamination of their parents' transgression. Any children potentially conceived through the adulterous relationship faced more complex determinations based on age, status, and religious signs observed during divination ceremonies. The executions themselves were witnessed primarily by members of the same gender and similar social class, women watching the woman's punishment, men observing the man's fate. This gender segregation reflected broader Aztec concepts about appropriate knowledge and spiritual contamination. Certain details of female punishment were considered dangerous knowledge for males to possess directly, and vice versa. After death, their bodies received treatment reflecting their transgressive status. No elaborate funeral rites, no jade bead in the mouth for the afterlife journey. Their remains were disposed of in locations specifically designated for moral transgressors, neither proper burial grounds nor places of honor. Symbolically separated in life by their execution locations, they remained divided in death by careful spiritual geography. Their names entered the community's moral vocabulary, not directly, as naming the dead could summon them, but through circumlocution. Those who broke the sacred bond became a reference in parental warnings to adolescents about proper sexual behavior. Their story, stripped of identifying details but rich in cautionary elements, became part of formal marriage instruction for young couples. The thief's flaying represented perhaps the most visually dramatic punishment in the Aztec repertoire, but its full ceremonial context reveals dimensions beyond mere brutal deterrence. The process began long before the actual flaying, with elaborate ritual preparation of both victim and community. After his third theft conviction confirmed him as a habitual offender beyond rehabilitation, he was placed in isolation for a specific period determined by divination, typically 20 days, aligning with the fundamental Aztec calendar unit. During this isolation, he was visited regularly by priests who explained the cosmic significance of his coming punishment, the connection between his actions and larger disorder, and the transformative purpose his death would serve. This wasn't merely psychological torture, but genuine religious instruction. The Aztecs believed that understanding the cosmic purpose of your punishment could transform suffering from meaningless pain to transcendent participation in divine order. While modern sensibilities recoil at such rationalization of brutality, within the Aztec worldview, this preparation offered a form of spiritual dignity even to condemned criminals. The actual flaying occurred during a specific festival associated with Xipe Totec, the Flayed One, deity of renewal, agriculture, and goldsmiths, whose mythological flaying created the first seed covering and taught humans the concept of renewal through sacrifice. The punishment thus doubled as religious ritual, the criminal's suffering elevated from mere penalty to sacred reenactment. The technical process was performed by specialized priests with obsidian knives, who removed the skin as intact as possible. The condemned was typically drugged with pulque and psychoactive substances that both dulled pain and induced a state considered spiritually receptive. Death usually came from shock and blood loss during the procedure, though in some cases heart extraction followed flaying, ensuring both death and proper offering to additional deities. The skin itself then entered a sacred phase of use. A priest would wear it for 20 days, symbolizing the death-rebirth cycle central to Aztec cosmology. The wearer performed specific dances, received offerings, and participated in fertility rituals. The criminal's identity was temporarily transformed from lowest transgressor to highest sacred embodiment before the final disposal of the skin through ritual burial at the festival's conclusion. For the community, these events served multiple functions. Obviously, they provided extreme deterrence against theft, but they also created collective participation in cosmic maintenance, reinforced agricultural fertility symbolism vital to survival, and demonstrated the transformative potential of even the worst elements of society. The thief's literal skin became the costume for a divine performance that benefited the same community he had harmed through his crimes. Finally, the tree cutter's case illuminates how environmental offenses were understood in spiritual rather than ecological terms. Sacred trees weren't protected for sustainability reasons, but because they housed divine entities or marked important spiritual boundaries. Damaging them didn't just reduce oxygen production, it wounded the dwelling places of gods. After his beating with thorny branches, symbolic reflection of his crime, and public procession, the real work of cosmic repair began. He was required to plant not one replacement tree but several, each requiring elaborate blessing ceremonies where he publicly confessed his transgression and committed to their lifelong care. These weren't mere saplings but his tree children, spiritual dependents he had created through his destructive action. For years afterward, he performed regular maintenance, not just of these replacement trees, but of an entire sacred grove, watering during dry periods, adding sacrificial blood, usually his own, from ritual bloodletting, to strengthen their divine connection, clearing competing plants, participating in every festival associated with the deity whose tree he had damaged. His house burning, while seemingly excessive, contained important symbolic logic. Trees provided shelter in the cosmic landscape. By destroying divine shelter, he forfeited the right to his own. The cosmic ledger required balance, shelter for shelter, structure for structure. After the ceremonial burning, however, community members would help him construct new temporary housing, modeling the appropriate relationships between humans, divine entities, and the physical environment. Over years, through demonstrated care for sacred groves and proper ritual observance, he could gradually rebuild his permanent dwelling. Each addition, a proper wall, a better roof, required specific permission and blessing. His home literally grew in proportion to his demonstrated understanding of sacred environmental responsibility. By the time he completed a proper house, he had typically become a de facto caretaker of sacred spaces, his original transgression transformed into specialized ecological knowledge and responsibility. These expanded narratives reveal a crucial aspect of Aztec justice often missed in simplified accounts. Punishment wasn't just about the moment of maximal suffering, but about extended processes of cosmic rebalancing, public education, and, when possible, graduated rehabilitation. The performative elements weren't merely gruesome theater, but complex social lessons encoded in memorable dramatic form. Aztec justice combined extreme harshness with surprising sophistication, brutally deterrent but rarely random, violently public but carefully regulated, spiritually justified but practically effective. It created order through fear, certainly, but also through shared meaning and visible consequences in a world where both physical survival and cosmic stability seemed perpetually threatened. As we drift away from these tales of smoke and sacrifice, perhaps the most important insight is recognizing that even systems radically different from our own contain internal logic and complex purpose. The Aztec world was neither savage chaos nor noble perfection, but a sophisticated civilization grappling with universal human challenges through its own distinctive cultural lens. Its justice system, however alien to modern sensibilities, answered the same fundamental questions all societies must address. How do we maintain order? How do we balance individual actions with collective needs? How do we translate cosmic principles into daily behavior? And perhaps most fundamentally, how do we sleep at night knowing just how quickly we could end up painted black, featherless, and explaining ourselves to an audience that's definitely not there for our benefit? Chapter 6. So, here we are. You followed the winding canals, dodged a few symbolic beatings, perhaps winced your way through a chilly smoke discipline chamber. You've seen the best, and very much the worst, that Aztec justice had to offer. And now, as we begin to wind things down, let's move from the individual to the collective. Because no matter how fierce a civilization, no matter how tightly it holds its laws, its rituals, its sense of order, time comes for all of them. And for the Aztecs, it didn't knock. It barged in with steel, horses, and smallpox. But before we get to that dramatic exit, let's pause. The end of the Aztec Empire wasn't a single event. It was a slow, cracking fracture, like a mask worn too long, starting to splinter under its own weight. This chapter is about the final echo, the last legal codes, the collapsing rituals, the way justice tried to keep its grip even as the ground shifted. Let's take a breath. fluff that pillow. Maybe shift your blanket just a little, and let's drift into the quiet unraveling of a world once held together by fear, faith, and feathers. When Hernan Cortés and his small band of adventurers first stepped onto Mexican soil in 1519, the Aztec Empire was already experiencing internal tensions that would contribute to its downfall. The triple alliance of Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan that had dominated the Valley of Mexico for nearly a century was showing subtle signs of strain. Subject peoples chafed under tribute demands that seemed ever increasing. Noble factions within Tenochtitlan itself competed for influence. Religious authorities debated troubling omens that had appeared in recent years. The Emperor Moctezuma II, he of the famous meeting with Cortés, had been ruling for about 17 years at this point. His reign had seen both expansion and increasing rigidity in the imperial system. Legal codes became more elaborate, religious observances more demanding, social hierarchies more firmly enforced. The machinery of control tightened even as the empire stretched across more territory and incorporated more diverse peoples. The legal system, as we've explored in perhaps excessive detail, was a key pillar of this control. By 1519, it had reached a level of development that impressed even the Spanish chroniclers, no strangers themselves to elaborate legal structures. The courts functioned efficiently. Judges dispensed justice with theatrical flair. Public punishments reminded everyone of the cost of disorder. But beneath this impressive surface, subtle shifts were occurring. The increased scale of the empire created administrative challenges. Local legal customs sometimes conflicted with imperial standards. The distance between central authority and frontier regions stretched the effectiveness of enforcement. Most significantly, the sheer wealth flowing into Tenochtitlan created new forms of corruption and status anxiety that the traditional system struggled to address. Then came the strangers from across the water. The Spanish arrival didn't immediately destroy Aztec legal and social systems. Contrary to popular imagination, the conquest wasn't a matter of weeks or months, but unfolded over years. During this time, Aztec institutions continued functioning in increasingly unusual circumstances. Courts still heard cases. Punishments were still carried out. The massive bureaucracy of empire continued its daily work even as its foundations began to crumble. What happened to the elaborate justice system as the conquest progressed? The transformation was neither instant nor complete, but occurred in stages as Spanish control expanded and colonial institutions gradually replaced indigenous ones. In the earliest phase, when Cortés was still maneuvering politically and militarily, he actually made strategic use of existing Aztec legal structures. Local lords who allied with the Spanish against Tenochtitlan were initially allowed to maintain their traditional justice systems, merely adding acknowledgement of Spanish royal authority. This pragmatic approach helped Cortés secure crucial indigenous allies who resented Aztec domination. During the siege of Tenochtitlan itself, 1520 to 1521, a strange dual system operated. In areas under Spanish control, a hybrid justice emerged. Indigenous nobles still judged minor cases using traditional methods, while Spanish authorities claimed jurisdiction over major crimes and anything involving European individuals. In Tenochtitlan, meanwhile, traditional Aztec justice continued operating with increasing desperation, now adding collaboration with invaders to its list of capital offenses. The fall of Tenochtitlan in August 1521 marked a decisive turning point, but did not immediately erase indigenous legal structures. Instead, The early colonial period saw what scholars call legal pluralism, different systems operating simultaneously for different populations. Spanish law governed Europeans and major cases. Modified indigenous law, stripped of its most offensive elements from a Spanish Catholic perspective, continued handling day-to-day disputes among native populations. This arrangement suited early Spanish administrative needs. With limited personnel and resources, they couldn't immediately replace the entire indigenous governance structure. Local leaders who accepted Spanish authority were allowed to maintain forms of traditional justice, provided they eliminated human sacrifice, abandoned idolatrous religious elements, and acknowledged ultimate Spanish judicial authority. For ordinary Aztecs during this transitional period, justice became increasingly confusing. Traditional punishments were modified or abolished. No more flaying, heart extraction, or burning alive. New crimes appeared, worshipping old gods, practicing native religious ceremonies, failing to attend Christian services. New authorities emerged. Spanish magistrates, Catholic priests, colonial officials whose understanding of local customs was often limited and distorted. The Spanish brought their own theatrical approach to justice. Public executions, floggings, and stocks replaced Aztec punitive spectacles. The symbolism changed. Crosses instead of obsidian knives, Christian penitence rather than cosmic rebalancing. But the public performance aspect remained. Both systems understood the power of visible consequences. Indigenous nobles found themselves in particularly ambiguous positions. Sometimes they served as intermediaries, translating between systems both linguistically and conceptually. Sometimes they preserved elements of traditional justice by disguising them within acceptable colonial forms. Sometimes they became enforcers of the new order against their own people. Their legal authority, once based on divine connection and ancestral lineage, now derived from Spanish recognition, a fundamentally different source of legitimacy. For common people, traditional methods of dispute resolution often continued informally at the community level, especially in rural areas where Spanish presence was limited. Village elders still settled minor conflicts using customary approaches. Traditional moral teachings were preserved, though increasingly merged with Christian concepts. The Huehuetlatoli wisdom sayings were recorded by early missionaries who recognized their ethical value, even as they tried to purge them of pagan elements. Legal documents from this transitional period reveal fascinating hybridization. Court records show indigenous plaintiffs using Spanish legal concepts to pursue traditional claims. Marriage disputes cite both Catholic doctrine and pre-conquest Aztec family norms. Property conflicts reference Spanish law alongside ancient communal land principles. People navigated between systems, using whichever offered advantage in their particular situation. By the 1540s, approximately 2 decades after the fall of Tenochtitlan, more formal colonial institutions had been established throughout central Mexico. The Spanish created a specialized legal system for indigenous affairs, the República de Indios, with its own courts, procedures, and modified laws, based partly on pre-conquest practices but increasingly aligned with Spanish legal principles. Indigenous communities maintained limited legal autonomy under the system. Native judges, now called gobernadores or alcaldes rather than traditional titles, continued hearing minor cases. But these officials were selected through processes approved by Spanish authorities, required to be Christian, and subject to colonial oversight. their jurisdiction was limited to minor crimes and civil disputes among indigenous people. Anything serious or involving Spaniards went to colonial courts. The punishments these modified indigenous courts could impose were severely restricted. Execution was reserved for Spanish authorities. Corporal punishment was limited. Enslavement was prohibited, though replaced with other forced labor systems that functioned similarly in practice. The theatrical elements of Aztec justice, the elaborate symbolic costumes, the status-marking body paint, the cosmic performance aspects largely disappeared, replaced by more straightforward Spanish penalties. By the late 16th century, as the first generation raised entirely under Spanish rule reached adulthood, knowledge of traditional Aztec legal principles began fading. Indigenous communities still maintained distinct identities and some customary practices, but increasingly operated within colonial frameworks. The elaborate cosmic justifications for justice were replaced by Catholic moral theology. The tight connection between religious observance and social order remained, but now centered on a different deity with different requirements. Legal documents from this later period show indigenous plaintiffs and defendants increasingly using Spanish legal concepts and procedures without reference to pre-conquest norms. Appeals cite Spanish laws rather than ancient wisdom teachings. Property disputes reference written deeds rather than traditional communal rights. While some communities preserved elements of traditional justice informally, its institutional foundation had largely disappeared. The final whisper of the Aztec legal system might be found in the persistent patterns that survived centuries of colonization and independence. Certain concepts proved remarkably durable: communal responsibility, public accountability, the moral authority of elders, symbolic restitution. These elements continued influencing local justice in indigenous communities long after the empire's collapse, sometimes persisting in remote areas into the modern era. Even in contemporary Mexico, anthropologists and legal scholars have documented indigenous communities where conflict resolution still incorporates elements recognizable from pre-conquest patterns: public apology and symbolic compensation, community-witnessed reconciliation, moral instruction by elders, ritual cleansing of social disharmony. These aren't fossilized Aztec practices, but living traditions that have evolved over centuries while maintaining conceptual connections to ancient approaches. Perhaps the truest heir to the Aztec legal tradition isn't found in formal Mexican law, but in the complex, informal justice systems operating in communities where state authority has historically been limited or mistrusted. When official courts seem distant or unresponsive, people often create alternative mechanisms that echo ancient patterns: public accountability, restoration of harmony, visible consequences for wrongdoing. What lessons might we draw from this long, strange journey through Aztec justice and its aftermath? Perhaps the most obvious is the remarkable resilience of legal cultures. How fundamental concepts about right, wrong, and social order can persist even as their outward forms change dramatically. The bloody heart of Aztec sacrifice disappeared, but the underlying concern with maintaining cosmic balance found new expression in Catholic ritual and colonial order. We might also note the pragmatic adaptability of legal systems in contact situations. Both Aztec and Spanish authorities made strategic compromises during the transition, creating hybrid mechanisms that served immediate needs while gradually shifting toward colonial norms. Justice wasn't simply imposed by conquerors, but negotiated through complex interactions between systems and individuals pursuing their own interests within changing frameworks. Most fundamentally, the Aztec legal experience reminds us that justice is always embedded in larger cultural narratives that give meaning to punishment and order. The specific mechanisms, whether obsidian knives or Spanish gallows, matter less than the stories societies tell about why rules exist and what breaking them means. Change those stories, as the conquest did, and even familiar practices take on entirely new significance. As the last echoes of Aztec justice faded into colonial reality, the people themselves adapted, survived, and created new forms of identity and community. The empire collapsed, but its people endured, incorporating new elements, preserving crucial traditions, navigating between worlds in ways their ancestors could never have imagined. Their legal journey from cosmic theater to colonial compromise to modern hybridity reflects the larger story of cultural resilience in the face of overwhelming change. And with that, our tour through the strange world of Aztec justice reaches its end. We've witnessed the sweaty reality of daily life, explored the cosmic terror of religious order, examined the theatrical punishments of imperial law, and traced the gradual transformation of a legal universe under colonial pressure. From heart extraction to Spanish stocks, from obsidian blades to Catholic penances, we've followed the thread of how one society attempted to maintain order in a world it perceived as perpetually threatened by chaos. As you drift towards sleep, perhaps ponder this final thought. The Aztec world, for all its alien brutality, was built by humans not fundamentally different from ourselves, people seeking security, meaning, and order in an uncertain cosmos. Their solutions may shock our sensibilities, but their fundamental questions remain our own. How do we balance individual freedom with collective needs? How do we maintain social order without excessive cruelty? How do we translate abstract principles into practical justice? The Aztecs answered these questions through cosmic theater, sacred violence, and ritualized rebalancing. We've chosen different methods, but the questions themselves, they're still asking us for answers, 500 years after the last Aztec judge pronounced his final verdict. Sleep well, dear listener, and perhaps be grateful that your legal system, whatever its flaws, doesn't involve quite so many obsidian knives. Wait, one final thing before you doze off completely. Are you absolutely certain you swept your doorway properly this morning? Just checking. The cosmic order thanks you for your attention to detail. The gods are watching, always watching. Sweet dreams. The end. An important note for the modern reader. The narrative you've just explored represents a creative interpretation of Aztec civilization based on historical records, archaeological evidence, and scholarly understanding available as of the time of writing. Like all historical reconstructions, particularly of non-literate or partially literate societies, it contains simplifications, generalizations, and some degree of imaginative reconstruction. The Aztec civilization was complex, diverse, and evolved significantly over time and space. Regional variations existed within the empire. Different social classes experienced justice very differently. The surviving evidence comes primarily from post-conquest sources written by either Spanish colonizers with their own biases or indigenous scribes working under colonial conditions, often decades after the events they described. This narrative has emphasized certain dramatic aspects of Aztec justice, particularly the more severe punishments and theatrical elements, which, while historically attested, may have been less common in day-to-day practice than their prominence in surviving records suggests. colonial observers often documented the most spectacular or, to their eyes, shocking practices rather than routine legal functions that more closely resembled their own experiences. Modern scholarship continues developing more nuanced understandings of Mesoamerican civilizations generally, and Aztec society specifically. The picture that emerges is increasingly sophisticated, revealing a culture that, while undeniably different from our own in fundamental ways, possessed complex philosophical, ethical, and legal thinking that belies simplistic characterizations as either primitive or barbaric. If this journey through Aztec justice has sparked your curiosity about Mesoamerican civilizations or comparative legal systems, numerous excellent scholarly and popular works offer deeper exploration of these fascinating topics. The strange world of Aztec law provides not just historical curiosity, but an opportunity to reflect on how profoundly cultural worldviews shape the fundamental human endeavor of creating and maintaining social order. And now, the fire is low, the torches have burned to embers, the temples are shadows, the streets of Tenochtitlan, so once full of warnings, parades, and punishment, are quiet. Maybe you're still awake, or maybe you're already drifting, half dreaming of obsidian and feathered cloaks. Either way, let this last thought linger. You live in a world with soft pillows, dental care, and, most days, legal systems that don't involve chili vapor or being flayed for stealing a snack. So, the next time you're complaining about slow Wi-Fi or a lukewarm latte, just remember, you could be waking up to a goat in your bedroom with no running water and a very questionable breakfast. Sleep well, my friend. Tomorrow will come gently.